Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. As part of the SciPol series of Canadian Science Policy Center, we are here with you with another exceptional panel. My name is Mehrdad Hariri, and I'm the CEO and President of Canadian Science Policy Center, and pleased to offer you another exceptional panel on open science and research security. Before anything, I would like to acknowledge the land that I'm talking to you from in Richmond Hill, Ontario, which is the traditional land and unceded territory of Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples, whose presence continue to this day, and we thank them for hosting us in this land. Today, we also celebrate the National Indigenous Peoples Day. This is the day to reflect the unique cultures and outstanding contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Canada. I highly encourage everyone to take the opportunity to learn more about this day and the extremely rich culture of Indigenous peoples across this land and their contributions. As for today's, the Open Science and Research Security is an exceptional panel coming to you, and I am pleased to introduce the moderator of this panel, Dr. David Castle. Dr. Castle is a professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of Victoria, and his research is focused on science, technology, and innovation policy. David used to be the Vice President Research at the University of Victoria since from 2014 to 19, and is a Director of Canada's National Research and Education Network provider, Canary, and is the Chair of Research Data Canada's Steering Committee. He is also a member of the Science Advisory Committee of the Council of Canadian Academies. And without any further ado, Dr. Castle, I want to ask you please to join me in the screen and lead the panel session.
Great, thank you so much, Mehrdad. Thank you for the words of introduction. And thank you as well to you and your staff at the CSPC for having invited me to chair this panel. And I'm joining you from Ottawa because one of the other things that I do, in addition to what Mehrdad had mentioned, is that I'm a researcher in residence on loan from the University of Victoria to the Office of the Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister. And in that capacity, I have some ongoing activity supporting the Chief Science Advisor in her efforts to understand the relationship between open science and research security, and to advance both of those at the same time. And that really brings us to the subject of our panel for today, is to think about the relationship between open science and research security, and some of the issues at the intersection of the two topics. And so I'm very delighted to have the panelists here with me today to discuss this topic from a number of different angles and perspectives. And so I'll introduce each in turn, and they can just add a little bit of detail about what brings them to this panel, because they have their bios included in the CSPC material. But we'd like to know a little bit more about what it is that they're bringing to the table and conversation for today. So I'll begin first with Dr. Martha Crago, who's the Vice President, Vice Principal Research and Innovation at McGill University. And so Martha, could you tell us a little bit about what you're coming to the panel with today on your mind?
Okay, well, it's a very interesting combination of things we're discussing. And I was first asked a while ago, this probably was about 2018 or maybe even 17, to be on an open science road mapping group that the Chief Science Advisor had put together. And at McGill, I think we're the only university we figured out by looking at different strategic research plans of the U15 universities that mentions open science. And that's primarily because we have a big initiative at the Montreal Neurological Institute on open science. On the other hand, I've been an avid and involved follower of the research security issue since 2018, when as chair of the research committee of the U15, I helped to organize what is now called the University's Government of Canada working group on issues of research security. And then I served as Canada's representative along with Sinead Treat from ISED on the OECD expert panel that has written a document that was soon to be released, if it's not formally released now, on what was called research integrity and research security. So I've been playing in this space, and I'm very interested to hear what others have to say this morning.
Great. Thank you so much, Martha. And Dr. Monica Granados, Open Climate Campaign Manager. Monica, tell us a little bit about what you're bringing today.
So much, David. And thank you for the invitation to be here. My path to sitting on this panel actually started probably like many of you as a researcher. So I'm a trained ecologist. Actually, my PhD is from McGill University, where I learned my passion for open science. I was introduced to different ways of doing science that made the work that I was doing more understandable and more accessible. That eventually brought me to starting a not-for-profit called Pre-Review that helps review preprints. And I think we're going to be talking a little bit about how tools like that are open and built in the open can help us with research security. And eventually to a position at Environment and Climate Change Canada, where I was working on as a policy advisor on open science and touched on some issues on research security. My present position is as you mentioned, the Open Climate Campaign Manager, where I'm working on a multi-year campaign with Creative Commons to make open for data and information around climate and biodiversity research the default. So we know that we have many grand challenges in front of us. Perhaps the biggest is climate change. And in order to help solve big issues like climate change, we need to have the data and information open to help us solve those problems.
Great. Thanks very much, Monica. And next, Emmanuel Kamarianakis, who is the Director General, Innovation and Education at CAC. So, Emmanuel, tell us a little bit about what's on your mind as you're joining the panel today.
Yeah, thanks, David, and it's great to be here, and thanks to CSPC for the invitation and for joining this great panel, and I think a really important and topical discussion. And that's kind of my approach to it as well, is that it is, I think, very important and very significant at this point in time for us to talk about these things. I've been in my current role for just under 4 years, and I have to say, I wasn't expecting to be as engaged as I am from a science policy perspective, let's say, on the issue of research security and open science. And in a way, it kind of makes a lot of sense as we watch kind of the world evolve and geopolitics and geoeconomics kind of move in different directions. We see the rise of protectionism, we see the rise of trade restrictions. We saw with the pandemic, things like limitations on PPE, and all these things sort of indicate that the world can be unstable when it comes to open and free flow of goods and services and information potentially. So we're very sensitive, and my job is to kind of help provide a platform for us to be able to have these conversations and be sensitive to the issues that provide risks to an important issue, which is open science, and then as well, the flip side of the coin, the issue of research integrity and research security as well. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, David.
Great, thank you, Emmanuel. And last, Mark Williamson, who's Director General, Defense Research and Development Canada. So Mark, you're coming to the panel. Tell us a little bit about what's on your mind.
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you this afternoon and hear from my colleagues on this panel. You know, with Defence Research and Development Canada, our role really, one of our challenges at the moment is finding that right balance between that open science and research security. I find, you know, there's these three intersecting elements: research security, open science, and then economic security, and they're intertwined. And so our challenges internally here and externally as we work with partners is one of finding that right balance. It's clear that science, open science, is a critical driver for greater innovation and inclusion in research and development, and the benefits that will accrue to Canadians from that. But it's also important from our perspective that that the government and research community alike are aware of some of the potential research security risks, and with that we take some of the necessary steps to ensure that the work is secured from malicious actors. It doesn't take me to say that Canada's prosperity and its position in the world relies in part on openness for its science approach and collaboration. So research security requires, in our mind, a thoughtful and considered balance between the risk mitigation and then fostering an open research environment. So my role currently with Defence Research is Chief of Staff, but previous role was as R&D policy and advice to the Assistant Deputy Minister and the advisor. So really welcoming the opportunity to talk a little bit about this and get into a little bit more detail as we complete the webinar. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate those remarks. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time just raising some issues and doing a bit of a tour de table on some of these issues that are at the interface of open science and security. And so let me just start off with a very general question for the panel. Perhaps one or two of you would like to respond to this, and then we'll move on to another question. But let me just ask you a very general question about what do you think are the very obvious pros, I suppose, of having access to data and information in the way that is envisioned in the open science movement. But what are some of the less obvious cons here about open access that might make us think twice about always making everything open? So who would perhaps like to just comment on this question to begin with? And Monica.
That's probably just so happy to start. I think one of the more obvious cons that we don't talk a lot about is that I think there's always, we equate open with free. And open is not free. We need infrastructure, we need personnel support, we need training, and all of that can be bundled under the umbrella of resources. And so in order for you to make your publication open, behind that, there needs to be infrastructure, there needs to be support, there needs to be a technician, who's there to make sure that paper is accessible when you go and sensibly feel like you're going in and getting something for free. And so that has some effects both in the community here in Canada, in that we need to put resources towards making our science more accessible, but it often also has some negative effects in the global south, where the costs of some of these infrastructures, the costs of article processing charges, make participating in the open science endeavor pretty difficult to do. And so I think it's important to highlight that open science should be the default, but to recognize that it's not free.
Okay, so you're advocating open science by default, but with appropriate limitations, and it's figuring out how to respond to those. So I believe I saw Emmanuel's hand up next, but I think also Martha as well wanted to respond to this question. So Emmanuel?
Yeah, I'll be quick just to build on Monica's point, and I think she's spot on. And the one sort of example I'd want to give is sort of the issue of intellectual property and how we manage and build the guardrails around science that often leads to commercial results, and how the world is very asymmetrical in things like the application of the rule of law, the mercantilist approach, let's say, to science. And sometimes we assume that everybody else is going to play the game the same way we are. And that's not often the case. And with open science, I think there needs to be that sort of analysis about how open and what jurisdictions make the most sense to be the most open, and we should have gradients. Thanks, David.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. Martha.
Okay, let me just add in some little bits and pieces that haven't been already well expressed. I think we have to be really careful on the cost-based things, not to strangle our association-based journals. You know, it's not going to be simple for them to join in this game. And we know some of the big companies that hold a lot of publications in their hands and how much they're charging for this. So I do think the cost issue is a very significant one, and the results that will flow from that onto certain kinds of journals. I mean, it's clear that the good parts of the globalization of science, the speed with which one can access certain things, the ability to have better ability to do reproducibility of science and replicate certain findings. So these are all very important things. There's a bit of a confusion in my mind. Every once in a while at my university, I hear big supporters of open science saying it's faster to commercialization. But I never seen any evidence of that kind. And at the same time, some of the big supporters of this also say it's inevitable that you'll patent. And that will have to happen. So it doesn't avoid patenting, frankly, to have open science. And it's not clear to me that it actually makes translation faster. We would need evidence for that.
Thank you. Yeah, those are important observations, actually, especially when we think about wanting to secure research for motivations that are of economic interest around patenting and commercialization. So perhaps we'll get back to that topic later on, Martha. And Mark, what are your thoughts about pros and cons of open access?
Thank you. Yeah, just building on the other comments. I mean, I've got two thoughts. One is absolutely the infrastructure question of how we facilitate and enable the open science is an important one, because, you know, frankly, we're in the midst of a paradigm shift. We still have systems and institutions based on how we did science and how we reported on science 15, 20 years ago, and time has moved on. And so there's a quite a different landscape out there for that open science needs to be adapted to. The other comment I'd make is I find the word science in open science a little bit too broad. So you break that down. There's data sets, information sets, and often, particularly when you're in a collaborative domain, it's very difficult to know who actually owns some of that data, or at least the ownership of that data is not necessarily with the people you think it is, because everybody's contributing aspects. And so, you know, fundamentally, the accountability is if we're putting out data sets and information sets from my domain, then we need to be absolutely sure that the government of Canada and my department actually own that data before we put it out there. And often in a collaborative space, some of that gets quite fuzzy. But again, the systems really need to evolve. That the systems we have to enable open science really are still evolving to catch up to the, you know, the aspiration of the inclusivity of being very open with our science and our products. Over.
Great, thank you. I have another question for the panel, and I think I'm going to start with you, Monica, on this question. You know, you mentioned open by default. Do you think that there is such a thing that could exist like secure by default? And what I mean by that is, do you think that there are actually some fields of research or some types of data that should actually be, you know, presumptively controlled and then made accessible? Or do you think it's not so field dependent and it's always a use case dependent kind of situation? So how would you respond to a question like that?
Yeah, I think I'll like a little bit about what Mark was saying is that, you know, we're talking about things on a spectrum. And so just how we talk about, you know, maybe open on a spectrum, if we take that sub bullet of data within the umbrella of open science, is that also can exist on a spectrum. You know, this isn't a binary where either something is open or something is closed. Even within the definition or it being on the side of the spectrum where it's closed, there are different mechanisms that we can employ to make that data accessible to certain parties. And so, a great piece of document that we can refer to is the framework for open by default from the Office of the Chief Science Advisor, that dictates specific cases where you wouldn't apply an open by default. Some examples include indigenous data, so where, or indigenous data that is sovereign or respects indigenous sovereignty. Another great example from my own research, from my time as a researcher, is when I was working with species at risk. I don't want to post where a rare mussel or a rare fish was caught, so that poachers or even people who are just interested in the species will know exactly where to go and find it. So those are specific examples of where you would want to probably find yourself closer on the closed end. But there are still then ways within there to make that data selectively accessible. And so, you might have data partners that are working with you in different provincial and territorial authorities that might want to have access to where, the mussels are distributed or where the fish are distributed. There's also this new concept of data trusts. So where you've got a group of individuals that decides what type of data should be made available to whom, particularly for sensitive data. So I think there's more thinking and more tools around that end of the spectrum. That it doesn't have to be not only binary, but even within closed, there are different tools that we can employ to still allow the spread of data in service of why we want to share data and information.
Thanks, Monica. How about anybody else on a panel? Is this do we have some fields that should just be thought of as being from the start, needing security around them by default? Perhaps Mark, you have some views about this.
Again, it's not black and white. I mean, I think there are. I mean, take quantum science, for example. There are elements of that, or the application of quantum, which I think from the safety and from the defense, safety and security perspective, probably need to be a little bit more restrictive than not. Now, that's not to say, the reality is the quantum leadership in Canada is not going to be through necessarily governments. It's going to be through the universities and the folks pushing the limits of that particular science. The application, however, is something which from time to time, and depending on different departmental needs, will need to be more restrictive in terms of what we move out into in an open science context. So yeah, it demands this considered approach. Also a bit of a look ahead approach in terms of some approaches to science that are underway now. We may not know some of the both malicious and other applications in the future. So it needs a little bit of a considered approach, a deliberate approach to those kind of questions in terms of understanding the risk, and many risks can be mitigated, but as I say, it's not an open or shut case as I think Monica was alluding to. Over.
Yeah, Martha.
What's interesting to see is that the US came up with a very specific list of areas. And one thing that was a surprise to me, because the leaders of the Montreal of Open Science in McGill are from the MNI, the Montreal Neurological Institute, is that neurosciences and brain sciences was on that list. So I'm not sure why. I'm not sure what people in certain places do with that information, but it can be surprising what you find on lists like that. How people come up with them is beyond my understanding of the world. But we were also aware that during the time of COVID in June of 2020, there was a remarkable amount of cyber hacking going on into biomedical labs in our university. And we were alerted to this by CSIS. The researchers working in those labs had no idea And the question, of course, is a broader question. Should we be sharing vaccine information, or was everybody hugging it to themselves and trying to get an upper leg on it at that time? So, there's really strange and interesting context to some of these things. And then there's defense writ large, and then there's all the dual use things. The drones that are used for agriculture that are also used in defense situations. And I remember when I was at Dalhousie and we were developing a number of ocean monitoring devices, the Navy said to me, we'd like to talk to you because we need some of these, because what to you is monitoring is surveillance to us. This was all about fish, the way people saw it at Dalhousie. It was all about submarines off the coast of Nova Scotia from foreign countries to the head of the Navy. So this is really contextual.
Yeah, it's true. It's an interesting thing that your noise can be somebody else's signal in ways that are not always anticipated by the researcher. And one of the things you mentioned, Martha, which I find particularly interesting, is that there are sensitive technology lists that have particular interests associated with them, and then critical and emerging technology lists, which have other interests associated with them. And these are not always the same lists. Mm-hmm. And so when different, countries have different lists, and not all the technologies are necessarily consistent across them, which is an interesting thing. Although I think, defense and security partners endeavor to try to get some sort of consistency. Let's maybe change the topic up a little bit for a moment and just talk a little bit about questions that are really fundamental to open science, and end up taking an interesting nuance when we think about security, and that has to do with the broad topic of ownership. Who owns what, whether or not it's data or a publication or inventions arising or even intellectual property. So I'd be really interested to get your views about how we understand the evolution of ownership, broadly speaking, in all the ways I just mentioned in the open science context. But then again, what happens when we revisit that through the lens of research security, and what researchers and developers and institutions and governments tend to then think about ownership in that context? Martha.
Well, years ago, I learned from the legal counsel at McGill that all of the research data that comes from the agencies where the university has to push the final button, which is the tri-agencies and CFI and so on, belongs to the university. So that makes them susceptible, in my book, to how that data might get used eventually if it became completely open.
Any others?
Maybe I'll just jump in. I think it's a really good question, David, and open-ended, of course. And I think that for me, one of the things that we need to keep in mind in our society is that we need to kind of define the rules of the road, the rules of engagement in any relationship, whether you're going into a business relationship, an investment relationship, or a scientific collaboration relationship. And we sometimes think, we throw this word out, open science, and I think we all have maybe a slightly different idea of what it really means. But, for my sort of purposes, it really is, what ecosystem do you want to work in? Because not all ecosystems are global in nature. There are certain sectors like defense or security where we're going to work, let's say, within a Five Eyes construct, or maybe within a NATO construct. But there's other areas that are much more global, much more open. So even just kind of defining what open means. And then the second kind of point I'd make kind of builds on something that Mark mentioned earlier, and I'll interpret this sort of, the necessity to do due diligence about who exactly you're going to be partnering with, because it's a different world than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. There are different actors out there that interpret things like open science, things like personally identifiable information, the commercializable aspects of intellectual property in a different way than, let's say, we do. And I'm not saying that there's no scope for collaboration. There obviously is, and there should be, and we should be encouraging more collaboration. But that front-end due diligence, which may have come maybe after the fact sometimes, and there's many examples, and Martha's mentioned a few, there's many others like that where, it's not just monitoring, it's also, something else, surveillance. Those factors, I think, need to be baked in at the front end, as opposed to sort of midway or at the end of a project. And that just requires a bit of a different approach. And as you know, the government, and you've been part of this and others on this call as well, things like Safeguarding Your Research portal, it's more about educating the community, the Canadian community, about what exactly should be done to kind of prepare for and mitigate the risks that are out there.
That's an interesting point. And I'd actually like to take something that you said, Emmanuel, and kind of reframe it a little bit for Mark to respond to, because one of the things that I've always found interesting in this domain is there's a strong emphasis on the fact that the world has changed and people use information and intellectual property differently now. While accepting that proposition, we also recognize that corporate and state espionage is nothing new. Certainly predates the internet era. It goes long ways back. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a new set of problems to deal with. And I'd be very interested from your perspective, Mark. What do you think the new dynamics really are that we're confronting now that we need to pay attention, that say 10, 20, 30 years ago that we just didn't see, and that they actually now have important ramifications for how we think about what we're leaving open and what we're trying to keep secure?
Oh, so yeah, that's I'll give it a go. I mean, that's a wide question, a broad question. I think, and maybe they're not answering specifically, but the biggest challenge I see at the moment is trying to discern between science and misinformed science and misinformation. I mean, the internet's, you saw it play out in the pandemic. The unfortunate thing is people are getting their science information from really an unfiltered, unreviewed internet in terms of that. And so that's a big challenge. And so, but more specifically, I do think, the pace of change, the pace of technology and science development is just far outstripping our abilities often to set regulation and policy. And so we're always catching up, whereas in the past, it was a little bit more of a sedate tempo. But going back to your question in terms of the ownership, I mean, clearly the aspiration here is, for government anyway, is that the science that we do has been paid for through taxes and other things, and so we have an obligation to use that investment to develop the best science and to deliver on the products. And as I mentioned, I think the challenges, and I'll go back to Emmanuel's comment, is baking in the system up front, so earlier in the whole kind of continuum of formulating ideas and putting it to a test in the science domain, earlier on, formulating, what are you going to do with the product more deliberately. In the past, it was, okay, we'll do this piece of work and we'll publish it in a scientific journal or in a report. But it's a little bit more complex than that now. And so early on, putting it into the planning and the proposals to what are you actually going to do once this project ends, with the data, with the information, with the science, and with the output. It's a little bit like it's an analogy, perhaps. When we're working in space, in surveillance space, for example, how do you ensure privacy is respected? And so you don't do that at the end of the project, build that in from the very beginning. Likewise with open science, I think we need to be looking very specifically at the beginning of formulating a question and an approach that we include the forward plan in terms of how open and why not open should that science and information be. That's about a bit of a ramble around your question, I realize that, but
maybe we'll return back to it when I have some more specific questions for you, Mark, and we can get down to some more specific examples along the way. I saw, Monica, you had your hand up, and I'm turning to you just as you're trying to take a drink. So
I was actually going to just add, I wonder if we could even think about, further earlier in the timeline and think about training, but, training and building that into, your graduate training, the training to become a researcher, for you to be made aware of these potential security issues, and then hand in hand with how do you learn about, open science tools and techniques and practices. None of this right now is baked into any graduate training that you get in order to eventually become a researcher and then produce products. And I think that there should be an introduction to some of these problems and ideas and opportunities, because I think there is just there's some potential naivete there, as Martha was mentioning, is that when you're out there measuring fish, and you couldn't possibly think of any other nefarious reason why this would be used, or if someone comes and asks you, hey, can I have your data on fish, why they would ever have any other purpose for this. And I think it's because when you go through the scientific training and your development as a researcher, especially in some of these disciplines that are a little bit more collaborative and less traditionally under the umbrella of security like defense, that you cannot possibly imagine why there would be a negative use of your research. And so I think introducing these concepts earlier on and having them as part of a graduate training course that talks about security, but also talks about open science principles and tools, and then reinforcing them, like you said, in the research cycle, and having explicit mentions of how that making some risk registers on the product you're developing.
All right, thanks, Monica. Before turning to some specific questions for each of you, I wanted to ask one last open-ended kind of general question, and this actually is a question that's more about the maybe the intended or unintended use of the consequences of language use in the way that we talk about these issues. I mean, a lot, some years back with the beginning of the open science movement, people would say that we should have science as open as possible and closed as necessary. And then subsequent to that, people said, well, maybe it should be thought more of open by default or by design, so that then we just know that, as you had intimated earlier, Monica, that we assert openness as a guiding principle, and then apply conditions for keeping science a little bit closer as is required due to other factors that would make us want to limit it. So that's kind of where the language has come from. But recently we've started to see a bit of a substitution of terms. And now we talk about as open as possible and as secure as necessary. And I wonder what's happened with our language use here. Have we started to take research security as a synonym for closed, and that open and secure are actually on the same continuum in the way that open and closed would be on the same kind of continuum? And is that a good use of language if that's what we've done? Or are we still actually talking about something a little bit different, that there's open and closed, but security is some other kind of axis that we're talking about that's not the same axis, and that security and closed are not synonyms? And I'm asking this question. I know it sounds a little bit on the conceptual end of the spectrum, just about the terms, but the use of language matters. And I wonder whether or not this will have implications for whether or not we think that security and open science are compatible or not compatible, depending on where we start with the use of our terms. And so knowing that Martha has a background in linguistics and can take us all to school on these kinds of topics, I'm going to start with you, Martha, to ask you about Has the use of language here, is it helping us, or is it not helping us and come to grips with some of these really important topics?
Well, I never really thought about it this way, but it got me very interested. Because when we talk about closed, we're talking about security, we're also talking about IP and patenting. These are very different things. IP and patenting and commercialization helps to transfer things out to society, like medications, like all kinds of things that we have in our world. So there's a closed part, which is patenting, which most big open science gurus admit will happen sooner or later. And some of those gurus have things on the stock exchange.
Mm-hmm.
They formed companies, and they admit it will happen, but they want these medications to be in people's hands. They want them to be accessible. And then there's closed security. So I think we have to disentangle the two things. They get entangled because sometimes politicians get afraid that we're giving away IP. And they see other countries as profiting from that IP. So they've gotten very entangled with each other. You hear ministers of ISED saying, we don't want to give Canadian IP away to other countries via research partnerships with certain companies. But I'm going to tell you something that I basically tripped across. Just to contrast closed and closed. Okay, so let's think of an ultra-closed way of dealing with data. It turns out in the last couple of years, the Chinese government has put in effect a number of rules about data sharing, which makes it impossible to take data out of the country. And these are very striking rules now. I received a really interesting PowerPoint about this from the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. You really have to ask the government for explicit permission to share your data outside of China. So that's really closed. And I don't think we've ever thought of that level of, if you will, surveillance of data and rules about data not being shared. So it goes completely oppositional to open science and is completely, this is closed to us for whatever reasons, security, commercial, money making, use with certain ethnic groups. So I think there's closed and there's closed and there's closed.
Anybody else want to weigh in on the use of language and whether closed and secure are synonyms, or how do you think about these things? Mark, I saw your hand.
Yeah, so no, it's first of all, I'm glad you went to Martha first. Give me a little bit of time to think. But we tend to, it's complex. I mean, it is a complex situation, and we tend to try and simplify things and say closed, open. And I see this big continuum. Sorry, I'm waving my arms. Very closed and then completely open. If you go completely open, that's a little bit of naivety. And if you go completely closed, you're going to inhibit your national innovation abilities. So what is that right balance? And I think I don't know what the right balance is. All I know is that we strive to find that balance, and it's very context specific in my world anyway, in terms of the open and closed piece. And so, on the language, it doesn't help because it really provides that big gray zone. But perhaps it's because there's many different institutions and organizations trying to come to terms with open science, and so using different ways to articulate it, that doesn't help ultimately. But I think over time, again, I'd see maybe a stability coming out of some of the languages we're using. And I think, from the government's perspective, from what I've been exposed to, is we're starting to see that consistency. And just on a word of the complexity, because there is this intersection between the research security piece, the open science, and economic security, and it's all intertwined. And so that's what ferments that complexity. And we tend to try to simplify complexity, and sometimes it doesn't work with the language, as you're pointing out. And I see Emmanuel as...
Yeah, I was wanting to turn to Emmanuel to get his thoughts on this as well, particularly, how does the use of these terms and positioning of this sort of thing affect the ability to maintain trade and certain international interactions? It must make a big difference, I should think.
Yeah, no, listen, a very thought-provoking question, David, and I really like Martha and Mark's answers. They made me think even more. I fundamentally agree. I mean, language is extremely important in diplomacy and in many aspects of our professional and personal lives. And it seems to me that we just need to set, again, some kind of nomenclature that we can all roughly agree are how we're going to be determining what is what. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily happened. And I'll just quickly veer off into sociology for a second. And, the whole issue around the impact, rather, of social media, fake news, different media channels, starting to pay for quality media, because even 10 years ago, nobody was paying for the New York Times or whatever. And now, we're sort of going through a period in our society where this whole issue of open data, open information is being recalibrated. I think science is not immune to that. I think it's a subset. And so we still haven't come out of that. And we're seeing the impact in our political processes. We're seeing the impact in international relations. We're seeing the impact in our personal and professional lives. And so this is a piece of what is a much larger and wider conversation around language and other elements in our society. And let me just make a final point on Mark's links to economic security. I mean, he's absolutely right. We kind of there's a continuing towards economic security at the end. I think we need to be careful not to let it also veer off into economic nationalism, because you can draw a connection between I need to secure my economy from risks. But then you get into, well, I should also just protect my economy from competition because, hey, listen, it's me first. And that isn't how we, we operate our trade and investment relationships around the world. So we just need to be careful not to go to the next stage, which I think is a particularly, dangerous rabbit hole. I'll put it that way. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. And Monica, I think I saw your hand up as well there for a moment. So what are your thoughts?
Just a small interjection about language. I mean, I agree with all the points here. I think just the language specifically around open science. So we talk about open science, potentially being in contrast to or in opposition to security. But what part of open science are we talking about? Open science is a really big umbrella. I think you could very easily argue that looking at open access publication probably does not jeopardize research security. So whether your publication is behind a paywall or not won't make a difference in terms of nefarious actors using that information. And so I think that language and that specificity is important. Like, what part of open science or open science practices do we particularly need to focus on around research security? Because I think some are more, some practices are more vulnerable than others. And like I said, I think in particular, making your publications open access is not something that we need to be worrying about.
So I wanted to turn to a couple of more focused questions for each of you, but so Monica, maybe we'll just continue with you for a second, because I think you raised an interesting point about the fact that open science is a catch-all term. It includes all sorts of things, and what we might think about, open access to publications as part of open science is very different than we set of things that we might think about data. And so I was wondering whether or not, particularly from the previous work that you've done in your current role, thinking about climate, are there parts of the open science sphere that are more or less troubling to the kind of work that you're trying to do, like data ownership considerations, but also things like open access and open access to peer-reviewed, really thoroughly vetted scientific research versus preprint kind of work is another part of sort of openness. I mean, how, as you're trying to do your work, do you have to come across these different facets of open science differently, and how do you manage that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're, I'll address the issue of preprints because I think it comes up a lot when we talk about trying to make your research as open and as quickly, as accessible as possible, as quickly as possible. And this is particularly important when we're talking about global crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'll argue potentially also climate change. We need to have access to this information, to this data as quickly as possible. And some of the criticisms that have been leveraged around these types of practices is, the practice of science has, since the beginning of scholarly communication, has had some kind of peer review process that, for lack of a better word, vets the publication, and having other peers look at it, means that it should at least fit under the general and accepted practices of science. And the rise of preprints, the number of submissions to the preprint service during COVID-19 actually had an exponential growth. And so the criticisms that were leveraged against this is how are some bad faith actors using that information? And when we did see that, we did see groups that were trying to spread disinformation, use preprints in articles that then were disseminated to the public. And so I think what we first need to acknowledge is that preprints are not the only ones that are vulnerable to this type of misuse. We see that happen even in the traditional publishing pipeline. That is why we have the ability to retract articles, which is, happens unfortunately at a frequency that probably we would not like to see. There have also been cases of editorial boards using their power to push through publications that also shouldn't have passed, that vetting process. That being said, I think that there's also we can think about what are kind of tools that we could put in place to try to allow this new interest in making research open as quickly as possible and as accessible as possible, in the scope of the research timeline, to put in some safeguards, but also continue to support the flourishing of these types of practices. And so some of the work that I have done in the past, and there are many other organizations that are working on this, is putting platforms where you can do a rapid review of a preprint to do some of that assessment of a preprint to make sure that there's nothing malicious or dangerous in that preprint. These preprints do go through some verification or some assessment from the preprint server, but adding an additional layer, I think, could also help assuage some of those concerns while still capturing, again, some of that enthusiasm in the scientific community to try to make your research as openly and as quickly as possible accessible to other scientists and the public. Again, particularly for disciplines or for cases where we need to have that information as available to us as rapidly as possible.
Thanks a lot, Monica. I'm sure that'll elicit some discussion when we open up the Q&A. I had a specific question for you, Emmanuel, which is, I think the audience would be really interested in hearing your perspectives about, as you're working on behalf of the Government of Canada and you're interacting with international counterparts. Are you and your international counterparts, starting from the same page on open science, or is it a constant period of readjustment to think about these things as you go into discussions? I'm really thinking about, is open science and thinking about research security now just kind of ordinary bedrock of international diplomacy, or how does it look from your perspective?
It's again a really good question, David, and I think one that is a bit tough to answer because I'm not sure that the cookie has fully crumbled yet. It is fair to say that it is much more part of the agenda than it was even 5 years ago. It's also fair to say that depending on the country and the relationship, we have very different approaches. Some countries have a more litigious approach, let's say, and a more aggressive approach in dealing with some of the risks around research security and how do you mitigate risks around open science. Other countries may not have gotten to the same level of sort of concern as some others. What I can say is that for Canada, I mean, it's starting to become part of the bedrock of how we sort of, as a government at least, kind of address these issues, how we engage with the university sector, how we engage with the research community, players like MyTax and many, many others. And that's starting to permeate our international relationships. But it's also fair to say that, we are building out global architecture to be able to address it. So there are small group discussions with like-minded partners around research security issues, whether they're taking place in a NATO context, whether they're taking place in a G7 context or other smaller or larger groupings. We're careful to not let this become a developed versus developing world dynamic. I mean, at least that's my view, is that we need to be careful not to kind of let it be seen it's the rich countries club versus everybody else, because a lot of the research and a lot of the capacity, a lot of the IP being generated globally is coming largely from countries that are able to afford the luxury of having world-class research universities and hiring world-class researchers. So we want to make sure that we're not kind of just closing things off so that the developing world doesn't, benefit from what should be in many ways a global good that's being generated by much of the open science that we're doing. So that's a very fine line, and we want to be careful to, again, not veer into things like economic nationalism. I think Canada is we're not down that path, but there are other countries around the world that very much view the generation of intellectual property as being just purely for internal commercial interest, let's say. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit here to make a point, but just that sort of dynamic does play out in our discussions internationally. And we're also trying to build this into our global platforms, our global science technology councils around the world, working with players in the domestic ecosystem, whether it's D&D or the granting councils, the universities like McGill, and the work Martha's been doing to contribute. And that's another quick point I'd want to make, is that we're not just doing this in isolation as a government and saying, listen, here, we're going to speak on behalf of the whole research ecosystem. And we do to a point. But as Martha said, she's on a committee with Sinead Tuitt from ISET, at the OECD on research security. And so we really see this as a partnership, and we should try, to the extent that we can, speak with one voice as a country, not just as a government, but as the Canadian research ecosystem.
Right. Yeah. And this actually brings me thank you very much for that, Emmanuel. And this does bring me to Martha, and then I'll turn to Mark last before we go to our Q&A. And Martha, you've had an interesting lens on the world through your participation in this as co-chair on this OECD panel. And it was principles and guidelines for access to research data from public funding. So how did the world look to you from that perspective in this soon to be released report? Can you sort of tell us a little bit about what some of the key observations you had going through the OECD process?
Yeah, well, it was very interesting because it spread out over a period of time of more than a year. And I would say that in the beginning of the year, European countries like Japan, had not been tangling with this in the same way that some of these countries like Australia, Canada, US, and Great Britain, all linked together by their Five Eyes defense system, had been tangling with it. And so over time, you began to see certain of these countries coming out with their own guidelines, their own way to do risk mitigation. And that included Canada coming out with its own guidelines, roughly for the midway point. The recommendations are interesting. The interesting part to me about the OECD thing is a link to research integrity was made. In other words, a good science ecosystem needs research integrity, which means, no research misconduct, but also research security. And that's a very interesting link that in the beginning I was thinking, oh, wait a minute, we're just confusing everything here. Research integrity belongs here, security belongs here, but people kept talking about it and realized there was a link to it. So there are key recommendations that came out, but the other thing that really struck me was the need for a proportional response. And this was terminology that got used in Australia, or by Australians who were on the committee. And it indicated a systemic approach. In other words, universities and government need to work together on this. You need to make something that rises to the level of the concern, but not goes beyond it. And so I think that's a very, very important piece. However, I will say that the first recommendation of all is that the globalization of science is very important. So it begins by stating we need this. Now, what do we need to work, understand, and know to work within it? How do we get different actors in government working with different universities? How do we get different countries working with different countries? So I think this notion of systemic approaches and approaches of sharing approaches it became a very important part of what this group discussed. And I look forward to the report getting into the public, because I think people will find this discussion interesting will find that document.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Maybe we can plan a future session. When Martha mentioned proportional response, I saw you nodding, Mark, and I thought maybe this is something that's in the Department of National Defense and Canadian Armed Forces outlook and on open science. If you wanted to comment on that, and then we'll go to some Q&A.
Yes, no, just before I do that, I build on the comment from Martha and from Emmanuel. I mean, really, the perspective we have certainly is that research security is a distinctively shared responsibility between, the research community and government and industry to some degree. And so understanding those risks and taking the measure to mitigate them, so those proportionate measures, otherwise you'll go to one extreme or the other, is tremendously important, and really is needed to ensure that Canada continues to be a leader in scientific research and innovation, and that we continue as a society to benefit from significant investments in critical research. But yeah, so for the DND's perspective, we certainly, it is a question of what that proportionate response is. We recognize that, particularly now, there's significant gains from innovation to be made and technological advantage, and we can't do that in isolation. And so we have to benefit on other people's open science, as well as promulgating our own view of that, again with that proportionality. One of the things we've done, and it's out published, is of course trying to establish an action plan on this, and in terms of what we'll be doing over the next several years. Fundamental to that is an appropriate governance, and so understanding who's accountable within the defense science domain. So we have a chief science data officer, which is the chief of staff. So the governance piece is critical. It has to basically do that due diligence for that proportionate response as we look at things. But we've also recognized that, and I think Monica very early on mentioned this, is that we need to, and it's part of our plan, is to enable our staff, the authors of some of the science, and I do apologize, I think it's my son's phone ringing there. So the authors of some of this science, the data generators, and the software developers, all that mix of people who are actually generating this vast output, we need to enable them with new tools, because the system is still a little bit in the past, and it does take new tools to the infrastructure, I think, as Monica mentioned, to facilitate that. So governance, enablement, collaboration is critical. I mentioned earlier that we can't do any of the work that we do on our own in isolation. It's collaborative domestically, but also internationally. And funnily enough, going from Martha's comment, I do contribute to a Five Eyes community on security, research, and development. And we've all recognized, and they're approaching it somewhat differently, and there's lessons to be learned there. We've all recognized this growing imperative for research security, and ensuring that we don't stifle our innovation by going to the more extreme. So governance, enablement, collaboration is critical. But the final one is speaks really to the paradigm shift. So change management. So understanding and developing and teaching and exposing our young scientists as they come into the domain, and some of our more aged scientists on how to adapt to this, to the open science imperative, and articulating the benefits. So again, it's really a developmental change management. And I think getting at them earlier in their career, this will become second nature as they go about their tradecraft.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Thank you. Thanks for those observations, Mark. So we'll now go to some of the Q&A. There's some nice questions that have been submitted. So please feel free to submit other questions via the Q&A button. And I believe that the CSPC staff would probably like to launch a poll at this point in time, which is their custom. So as they're getting underway with those sorts of things, we'll turn to the first question here, which is really about even if you're a proponent of open science and sharing data, especially via publications, there's some hesitancy about when and how to do that as it relates to privacy concerns. And, Martha, you must encounter a lot of this in your role at McGill, particularly because of, McGill's stature with some, not only biomedical research, but, clinical research, and of course the Neurological Institute, which you've already mentioned. And what sort of things do you have to say about how to handle privacy in context of open science?
Look, I think I've got a couple of things to say here. One is, there are certain things that you can't do because of the ethics regulations that we live with and that we adhere to. So you cannot always make, unless people are agreeable to it, the identity of people known. Second of all, we have real governmental problems here. The provinces are responsible for health data. And even in the midst of a global pandemic, we're not willing to share health data, never mind with names on them. These were all anonymous data, and they weren't willing to share them into federal databases. So we have a very serious problem in a federated country like Canada, where the provinces do not line up with each other or with the federal government to share data. So that's a problem. Now, I'm going to read you something that I came across just as I was eating lunch about an hour ago. So this is in a Nature article. Most biomedical researchers don't respond to requests for access to the data underlying their journal articles or hand it over when asked, despite stating their willingness to share. So they looked at 1,800 journal articles in which authors indicated their data would be available on reasonable request. Only 14% of authors contacted responded to email requests for the data, and a mere 6.7% actually shared their data in usable form. So, open science has a way to go when you look at figures like that, and it's not clear to me what's making people not share them. Is it because they're concerned that they might have patient data, in which case there will be rules and regulations around it sharing? So I think this is one of the, or is it because they really don't want to share it? They don't want somebody else to look at it, scoop it, whatever. So it's complicated here, and I'm not sure that privacy is the biggest driver. I honestly think the situation we're in with Canada with our provincial health data is really very problematic.
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic. One of my former colleagues described the relationship between researchers and their data as squirrels hoarding nuts for a nuclear winter. And I think there's some truth to the underlying sentiment there that I, when we think, and I think this goes back to Monica's point about the open science is a vast thing to talk about, and open access. It's hard to find a researcher who is opposed to having their publications as widely accessible as possible, but not so much the data. So there's an interesting asymmetry and tension there. Now, I'm wondering, actually going back to you, Monica, there's a nice question here from a colleague who's joining us from New Zealand. So welcome. Talking about the publication world and the fact that, what we count as relevant literature, and if we're doing comprehensive literature reviews and searches and so forth, and of course, some of the best bibliometrics they're actually all kind of unilingual or unilingually oriented, which is a pretty substantive issue when you're thinking about certainly matters like climate change and climate action, which might actually be important observations, research coming from areas where English isn't the first language, or it isn't the dominant language in academia, or whatever it happens to be. So have you come across some of these issues just about the way that we've actually maybe skewed our conception of what counts as knowledge by the way that we use certain things that are in print?
Absolutely. There's so many aspects of science where you'll see the effects of science being done in English. You drew attention to one particular case that I see very often, and that is bibliometric databases that pretend to have a comprehensive, as Emily mentioned, corpus of all papers in in science. Often will not index papers that are not in English, or won't index papers from journals in Africa and Latin America that don't have a digital object identifier. And so how much knowledge are we missing because of the fact that we've just continued to do science in English, and frankly really haven't done a lot of challenging of that. In fact, what we do is we just ask people who are in countries that where English is not an official language to just learn English and then do science. And so I wonder how many individuals are we gatekeeping because of the science, and then even those who will circumvent that barrier, the challenges that they face, and then those who still do publish in a language other than English, that knowledge is being lost. And so I think it is an issue, and then I think it does fall under the umbrella of open science. And there has been some work looking at bibliodiversity along languages. I mean, I'm sure that this is a particularly important case even within Canada, where we have a lot of science that gets conducted in French, and then has to be translated to English. And what are we losing in that time? What are we losing in even the context and the translation? And so I think there needs to be a discussion about, are there, do we need to open this up to more than just English and challenge the status quo, or also look at tools. I mean, I think there's some growth in artificial intelligence in terms of translation. Are those particular tools that can also help us get access to make science that is in English accessible to other languages, and vice versa. And thanks for that question and for getting up so early.
There's another question here I'd like to turn to, which I think both Emmanuel and Mark will have more to say on. So it's a question about whether or not the research community and the tri-councils and the chief science advisor are paying attention to research partnerships. And the answer, of course, is yes. Certainly through the Safeguarding Research Initiative, there has been a lot of attention paid to the way that we're actually creating partnerships with companies, researchers, countries, and so forth. So, but I'd like to actually sort of broaden this question a little bit for Mark and Emmanuel to answer, because you know, there are lots of things that happen between countries. You can have research partnerships, you can have industrial partnerships with researchers, you can have trade, you can have differing views about geopolitical matters. Each of you sits on kind of a little piece of that land of all of those different types of interactions. And so what are the main things that you're concerned about and thinking about with respect to the movement of research as it relates to some of those other things like economic issues or geopolitical stances, trade, diplomacy, those sorts of things? Perhaps I'll start with you, Emmanuel, to hear what you have to say about those.
Thanks, David, and thanks for broadening the question as well, because it is a pretty broad issue. And that you're right. The short answer is yes, we do care, and we do track to the extent that we can what is happening in terms of those relationships. And I know the questioner put the country China in the chat. Even our approach is very much country agnostic, and it's in no way geared towards one specific or two specific countries. It's really a platform and a model for how we think we as a research community need to kind of interact internationally. And we're not doing this just because of some theoretical construct, because, hey, now it's all about research security and we're having these panel discussions in open science. There are real world examples of where, IP is clearly been stolen, or where research has clearly been misused or misappropriated. There are also issues around different approaches to, from a values-based perspective. How do you manage personally identifiable information? How do you manage facial recognition technology? How do you handle privacy issues? So there's a values-based discussion there as well. And our approach has been very much to make sure that the research community in Canada is aware of the framework under which we're operating as a country in terms of our international relations, the risks that exist out there with real world examples, and help provide tools to an extent to be able to teach people how to approach these risks and mitigate these risks. And in a way, when people are kind of doing business, or when we're all doing our shopping, we use the Latin term caveat emptor, right? Buyer beware. Well, in this context, I don't know what the Latin would be, but it's like, researcher beware type of thing. Who you partner with and how you partner with them internationally needs to be much more front of mind than it was 10 or 15 years ago. And there are concrete reasons why that needs to be the case. Mark, I don't know if you want to build on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that can't add too much to Emmanuel's overview there, but it is, our international partnerships in defense research are very, very important for us, and comparing and contrasting approaches to some very similar issues, but also there is, as you can imagine, some of our partners, the US has significantly greater resources availability, to some degree the UK as well, and so we find a lot of similarity with the Australian investment approach to defense research. And so it really is about being good partners for the US and for others. And being good partners means we need to be very diligent about our domestic partnerships as well, and who we're bringing into the tent for the discussions in these particularly the sensitive technology areas. So it's again, it's one dimension of research security, and being, I'll end with the note that being a good partner to some of our ally countries means that we are doing our own due diligence to make sure that we're not that we're not vulnerable. And absolutely, in the past, and there's really good, well-documented examples where there's been an exfiltration of our IP and other know-how to other more malicious use countries.
One of the things you just mentioned along the way, Mark, which I think is an interesting thing, is the thinking about the domestic landscape within Canada. So some of the conversation we've been having is thinking about how Canada stands on some of these issues as it relates to partners, collaborators around the world. But maybe we could actually just take a couple of these questions and almost reflect them back into the country. We talked a little bit about training for scientists. I assume we're talking about elevating people's knowledge, both within government science and also within the research college and technical institute context. And I'd be interested in each of your observations about this point about, you know, how far do you think we really have to go in Canada to socialize and make practical use of concepts like open science as it relates to research security, when you think about, you know, other countries that have had perhaps more experience with, say, defense research as it relates to their university environments, or more international collaborative interactions with countries that are more attuned to open science and research security kinds of issues, or have actually played stronger roles in helping the national stance on diplomatic issues be developed. Like, so is our research community here well positioned, or do we need to do quite a bit of work to get up to speed? Are we at a pace with our main collaborators and competitors? So what would we maybe need to do if we need to shore up what we're doing in Canada? And maybe I'll just start with you Martha, because I know you think lots about these issues, particularly from your vantage point on the government universities working group on research security.
Yeah, I think what I've perceived in the community in my university is that there are people now, because of the research mitigation framework and people having to reply to specific questions when they submit an NSERC partnership grant, an alliance grant. So this is a very relatively small number of researchers in any given university. They've kind of gotten up to speed on this. When I first began talking to people, and many of these people happen to be engineers at my university, the geopolitical context completely evaded them. But we've done a number of workshops with CSIS virtually, and some of them visits where people wanted to have a real in-face discussion of things. That have made more people aware, but I think there's still limits to how they understand it interacting with their own space, aside from the alliance ones who have to fill up a risk mitigation form. I think we have to do education. I don't know whether it was Monica who mentioned that, but I think there's a big need for education, both about the closed, you know, what are the different versions of closed, and what's the meaning of patenting? What's the meaning of open science that isn't patented? What's the meaning of research security? And what's the meaning of, you know, the importance of anonymized data? And then there's a final thing that came up in the question and answer. What's the meaning of people owning their own data, which usually gets solved through the ethics process of people signing off on agreeing to participate in a certain experiment or research in a certain way. So I think there's a huge need to educate, because I think these things are all mixed. We educate about ethics, and the students have to get ethics forms filled up for any of the research they do. But I think undergraduate on up, we have a big educational job that we aren't really doing yet, because most professors don't fully understand or engage with the breadth of research, closed research, or the breadth of open research. And of course, now the councils require a data management plan. So that's important. Mm-hmm. And it's become important for universities to recognize that Indigenous people in Canada do own their own data. And you have to deal with that if you're going to do work in those community, research work in those communities. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. Anybody else want to weigh in on question. How far do we have to go to help the research community in Canada adapt to the new reality?
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, as Martha said, there's a growing awareness of the risk and vulnerability. And so that's an educational thing. And I don't think that's done overnight. And I think it'll always grow in a manner commensurate with the development of science and technology in Canada, and the threats and risks we see now are not the same threats and risks we saw 15, 20, 30 years ago. So that environment will change. And so we have to keep adapting, I think, in the educational sense. And, over in the next 15 years, we'll have a whole bunch of new scientists in our academic institutions and government institutions. So it's a constant vigilance, I think, with a well-crafted education approach to education in terms of research security and open science and the benefits, the absolute wonderful medical and other benefits we get from open science, but also some of the darker side and some of the threats and risks that we face through having a very open society and democracy.
I think that the CSPC probably wants to launch their final poll as we get our comments lastly from Emmanuel and from Monica. Where do we need to go? Emmanuel, what do you think the research community could improve upon generally that might actually facilitate some of your efforts?
Great question, and I'll be quick. I want to leave time for Monica as well. I think that for me, the fundamental is to basically educate themselves as to the risks that are out there. But also the flip side is the opportunities that are out there. And there are significant opportunities. There's emerging technologies, there's new areas, the global economy is shifting, the global landscape is shifting. And so to kind of look at it not only from a defense perspective, but also from an offense perspective, but eyes wide open kind of approach. Because sometimes a door will close and certain relationships are just too difficult to manage from a research security perspective. Other doors open and other relationships are out there. So to really kind of just bring that sort of almost like a sort of a flip side approach to how to look at the issue and where to partner and how to partner.
Monica, last word to you before I give a couple of concluding remarks.
Yeah, sure thing. I agree with all of these comments and just the importance of training. Maybe the thing that I would add is that it would also just be good to do a landscape analysis, especially amongst the different disciplines, of what is the understanding of the potential for research security or for the vulnerability of your research to foreign or nefarious actors. I think that would also help us guide some of that training, whether that needed to happen on some disciplines and less on others. I think getting a good idea of where we are right now around that understanding of research security in trainees, but early career researchers as well as more senior researchers.
Great. Well, first of all, let me thank the four of you, Mark, Emmanuel, Martha, and Monica, for your insights and for joining the conversation. I found it really fascinating, and I appreciate your considered responses too to the questions that we got. I'm sure there'll be many opportunities to revisit this subject. I think all of you intimated one way or another that it's a moving target. Both open science our thinking about it evolves, but also research security and the relationship between the two. So I look forward to a future occasion where we can continue this conversation and check in and see where things have got to. And maybe we'll have an opportunity to do some of that at the upcoming CSPC conference in the autumn. And I hope everybody's looking forward to that and potentially being able to meet up in person, because they're always a tremendously fun event and lots of great networking and very inspiring sessions. And also the CSPC has suggested that if there are any other sidebar separate sessions like the one we've had today that you'd be interested in looking into, you can find those on the CSPC website. But CSPC also likes to collect feedback from the community about future sessions that could be held. So if you have any great ideas, there's a link in the chat there that Trudy has put up. So feel free to send to info@sciencepolicy.ca. So thanks again, everyone. Great session, and look forward to meeting you all again soon, and hopefully in person. So have a good afternoon or evening or wherever you are. Thanks very much.